Everyone in Blackwood City knew the name Marcus Voss. They said it in low voices. They said it the way people say the name of a storm that already passed through their town once and left nothing standing. Not with hatred. Not with admiration. With something that lives between the two, a careful, quiet respect that looked a lot like fear if you stood close enough to it. Marcus had built his name the hard way. He had started with nothing except a jaw that could cut glass and eyes that made grown men look away first. He had clawed his way through the construction business, the import trade, the private equity world, and 3 separate industries that politely asked him to leave before realizing, too late, that Marcus Voss did not leave things. Things left him. And they always came back worse for it. By the time he was 41, he owned the Voss Group, a holding company with fingers in real estate, logistics, and a string of private investment deals that nobody outside a very small room ever fully understood. He had an office on the 34th floor of a glass tower downtown, a penthouse above that, a driver named Carl who had been with him for 9 years and never once asked a question he wasn't supposed to ask. People called him the Vampire King behind his back. Not to his face. Never to his face. The nickname came from the way he operated. He moved at night. He showed up at things after everyone else had already settled in. He had this quality, this stillness, like the air pressure changed slightly when he walked into a room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence had weight. His silence had teeth. He looked at people with those flat gray eyes and they just gave him things. Contracts. Favors. Silence in return. He drank people dry. Not their blood. Their time. Their loyalty. Their usefulness. And, when there was nothing left to take, he set the husk down gently and moved on, and somehow the husk was always grateful for the experience. The only person who ever looked at Marcus Voss and did not flinch was Elena Reyes. She was 34 when she came into his world. She worked as an account manager for a mid-size logistics firm that the Voss Group was in the process of quietly acquiring. She was not supposed to be in the meeting that day. Her director had gotten food poisoning the night before. She walked in with a folder of numbers she had not prepared and a face that gave absolutely nothing away, and she sat down across the table from Marcus Voss and his 3 lawyers and she said, calmly, without clearing her throat, without touching her hair, your acquisition offer is 11% below what this company's infrastructure is actually worth. I can show you why, if you'd like. Or we can all keep pretending the number on page 4 is real. The room went very still. Marcus looked at her. Not the way he looked at most people, not the measuring look, not the extraction look. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he didn't expect and isn't sure yet whether to be irritated or interested. He was interested. He gave her 40 minutes to make her case. She used 32. When she was done, he revised the offer, which he had never done in front of anyone before, not once, not for any reason. His lawyer Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. That was October. By January, Elena was working for the Voss Group directly. By March, she was in Marcus's life the way weather gets into a house, you don't notice it happening and, then, one day you look around and everything is damp. She was not glamorous in the way that surrounded him. The women in Marcus's orbit were usually decorative. They wore the right things and said the right amount of nothing and understood their role the way furniture understands its role. Elena wore a gray blazer to a black tie dinner once because she had been working until 7 and didn't have time to go home, and she walked in looking like she had planned it that way, and somehow it worked, and somehow Marcus spent more time looking at her across that room than at anyone else in it. She was sharp. She was funny in a way that she almost hid dry, fast, the kind of funny that required you to be paying attention or you'd miss it entirely. She did not perform warmth. But she had it. Real warmth, underneath the precision. The kind that shows up in the small things. She remembered Carl's daughter's name. She noticed when the office cleaning staff changed and asked about the old woman who used to come Tuesdays. She brought Marcus coffee exactly the way he liked it, which nobody had ever gotten right before, and she did it without making a thing of it, without cataloging it as a favor he owed her. She just paid attention. She paid attention the way most people reserve for things they love. And Marcus, who had built his entire empire on the art of observation, on reading rooms and reading people and extracting the thing they were trying not to give, Marcus did not fully notice what she was doing. Not at first. What he noticed was that things ran smoother when she was there. Problems arrived on his desk already half-solved. Conversations he dreaded somehow resolved before he had to enter them. His enemies kept finding the doors closed that they expected to be open. He didn't always know why. He didn't always ask. Elena knew why. She had learned Marcus the way you learn a complicated piece of music, slowly, with her full attention, making note of every place where something could go wrong. She learned where his blind spots were. She learned which relationships he was managing badly, which old resentments were still quietly bleeding, which people smiled to his face and carried knives behind his back. She learned the fractures in his empire the way a structural engineer learns a building, not the surfaces, not the grand design, but the load-bearing points, the places where stress collected. And she protected them. Not loudly. Not in a way that announced itself. She redirected. She smoothed. She made the calls he didn't know needed making, had the conversations he would have handled wrong, positioned him in rooms before he arrived so that the energy was already where it needed to be. She was, in every real sense, the silent architecture of his safety. She was also, by the summer of the second year, in love with him. She didn't say it. She was too smart for that, or maybe too careful, or maybe too aware of what Marcus Voss did with things that were offered to him too openly. She knew his patterns. She had catalogued them. He consumed and moved on. She had no interest in being consumed. But she stayed. She stayed and she kept doing what she did, and she told herself that was enough, or that it wasn't love, or that it was the kind of love that didn't require anything back, which is what people tell themselves when they know the truth would make them do something inconvenient. Marcus was not gentle. That is a thing that needs to be said plainly. He was not cruel, not deliberately, not with the calculated meanness of a man who enjoys damage. But he had lived so long in a world where people bent to him that he had stopped noticing the bending. He assumed cooperation. He assumed presence. He took Elena's attention the way he took Carl's driving and Thomas's legal work as a part of the machinery of his life that simply functioned, that would simply continue to function, that did not require acknowledgement or care. He didn't say thank you. Not because he was ungrateful. Because it did not occur to him to say it. Because the idea that someone might need to hear it did not fully register. He cancelled plans without telling her. He ended phone calls mid-sentence when something more important arrived. He shared her time with his business the way a jealous man shares a woman with nothing, not at all, assuming the precedence, assuming the tolerance. She tolerated it. For a long time, she tolerated it. What she did not tolerate, and this was the thing that finally cracked the architecture she had so carefully built, was the night he introduced her to Daniel Crane. Daniel Crane was Marcus's oldest rival. They had a history that went back 15 years, back to a land deal in the east side of the city that had gone badly for both of them and left behind a mutual, permanent, well-dressed contempt. Daniel had built his own empire, smaller than Marcus's, but cleaner, more public-facing, with better press. He was the kind of man who showed up on magazine covers. He smiled easily. He gave money to hospitals. He was also, Elena had quietly established over the past 18 months, the man behind 3 separate attempts to destabilize the Voss Group's banking relationships. She had the emails. She had the paper trail. She had told Marcus twice, in meetings, with documentation. Marcus had listened and nodded and done nothing. Marcus did nothing about Daniel Crane because Marcus believed that he was the only serious player in any room he entered. He did not take Daniel seriously the way a lion does not take a large dog seriously. It was not arrogance so much as a failure of threat calibration. The night of the Whitmore Foundation dinner, a charity event, marble floors, 200 people in expensive clothing, Marcus arrived with Elena and walked directly to Daniel Crane and his group, and he shook Daniel's hand, and he introduced Elena by saying, "You know Elena. She handles the logistics side. She handles the logistics side. 18 months. The coffee. The fractures she had quietly sealed. The knife she had seen coming toward his back and moved, quietly, 3 times. She handles the logistics side. Daniel Crane looked at her with those clean, smiling eyes and, she saw, because she paid attention, because she always paid attention, the exact moment he understood what she was. What she had been doing. What she knew. And, she saw that he filed it. She didn't say anything that night. She smiled at the right moments and held her glass correctly and stood precisely where she was supposed to stand. But, on the drive home, something in her went quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. This was the quiet of a decision being made below the level of words. Marcus didn't notice. He talked about the Whitmore family's tax situation for 12 blocks and then looked at his phone until they reached his building. She went to her own apartment that night for the first time in 6 weeks. She lay in her own bed, in the dark, and she thought about the way Daniel Crane had looked at her. She thought about what he now understood. She thought about the meeting she had with Marcus the following Tuesday, where she had been planning to show him the third piece of the banking trail, the piece that connected Daniel to a shell company in the Cayman structure. She thought about she handles the logistics side. She went to sleep. Tuesday's meeting happened. She showed Marcus the shell company information. He looked at it for a moment and said he'd have Thomas look into it. Then, his phone rang and the meeting was over. Thomas never looked into it. She knew this because she asked Thomas 3 weeks later, casually, while passing him in the corridor, whether Marcus had sent him anything on the Crane matter. Thomas looked at her with the particular blankness of a man who was trying to remember something that had clearly been low priority, and she understood from his face that the folder she had built over 18 months had been set down on a desk somewhere and not opened again. That was November. By December, Elena had started doing a different kind of quiet thing. She began, carefully and, without any noise, to document. Not for the Voss Group. For herself. Every piece of protection she had been providing, every sealed fracture, every redirected conversation, every name and date and paper trail she had gathered about Marcus's enemies and vulnerabilities, she pulled it back. She didn't sabotage anything. She didn't take anything that wasn't hers. She simply stopped adding to the structure. She stopped being the architecture. She kept showing up. She kept being professional. She did her job, the official job, the one on the contract. But, the invisible job, the one she had built out of attention and love and a kind of fierce, quiet guardianship, she let that go dark. Piece by piece. Switch by switch. Marcus did not notice. This was, she thought, in the taxi on the way home one February evening, the most precise summary of the problem she had ever arrived at. He did not notice. She had been the walls. And, he had never once looked at the walls. She handed in her resignation on a Thursday. She made it professional and clean and undramatic, the way she did most things. She gave 6 weeks' notice. She trained her replacement, a competent young man named Owen who was excellent at the official job and had no idea that a different, invisible job had existed at all. Marcus did not fight it. He was surprised, she thought, in the way a person is surprised by whether they didn't check the forecast for. He said, "Is there something we can address?" in the tone of a man who is already deciding the answer is probably no. She said, "No, I think this is just the right time." He nodded. He had Thomas process the paperwork. 6 weeks later, she walked out of the Voss Group building for the last time. Carl held the door. He looked at her with the face of a man who wanted to say something and didn't. She patted his arm once. She got in her own car, not the company car, and she drove away. The glass tower shrank in her rearview mirror and she did not look back at it, which was not because she didn't want to. It was because she had already decided that looking back was the one thing she couldn't afford. She had left the walls standing. That was more than he deserved. She had left everything standing. For now. What she had not done, what she had been too careful, too principled, too thoroughly herself to do, was tell anyone what was missing. What the walls had been holding back. What Daniel Crane's smiling eyes had quietly recorded and was, even now, beginning to map. The invisible job was over. The vampire king was alone in his glass tower. And the wolves, who had been circling for 18 months, had just noticed that the shepherd was gone. The first 3 months without Elena were, by any visible measure, completely fine. The Voss Group continued. Deals moved. Contracts got signed. Owen handled the logistics account with competence and zero friction, which Marcus interpreted as evidence that the transition had been smooth and the loss manageable. Thomas prepared quarterly reports. Carl drove. The 34th floor hummed the way it always hummed. Marcus told himself, on the rare occasion that the thought surfaced at all, that he had perhaps over-relied on one person for certain functions. That it was good, in retrospect, to distribute that kind of institutional knowledge. That the structure of the organization was stronger than any individual role. He believed this the way a man believes he's fine after a long illness, with the specific confidence of someone who has not yet tried to run. The first crack appeared in April. It was a banking matter. Routine refinancing on a commercial property portfolio, 4 buildings in the downtown corridor that the Voss Group had held for 7 years and which generated predictable, reliable income. Marcus had done this refinancing twice before without issue. The lender was a regional bank, long-standing relationship, 2 or 3 levels below the kind of institution that would give anyone at the Voss Group a second thought. Except this time the application stalled. Thomas got back a request for additional documentation. Marcus's finance director, a solid man named Gerald, made the calls and got vague answers. The loan officer was polite. The loan officer was thorough. The loan officer kept requesting things: one more audited statement, one more explanation of a specific holding structure, one more clarification on a subsidiary's registration. It was the kind of administrative friction that didn't look like anything from the outside. It looked like paperwork. It looked like due diligence. Gerald flagged it to Marcus in a Tuesday meeting. Marcus frowned at the summary sheet and said he'd have Thomas reach out to the bank's senior relationship manager, which was the appropriate response, the professional response, the response of a man who had handled 100 similar situations. What Marcus did not know, what Elena had known and had been quietly managing for 14 months, was that the bank's senior relationship manager had, 18 months prior, been in a private conversation with a man connected to Daniel Crane's investment network. That the regional bank had been, slowly and invisibly, repositioned. That the loan officer requesting additional documentation was not being thorough. He was being instructed. Elena had found this thread in the previous October. She had traced the connection, documented it, and had been in the process of positioning Marcus with a competing lender, laying the groundwork, having the relationship lunches, making sure the Voss Group had an alternative route before it ever needed one. She had told Marcus about this twice. He had nodded and moved on. She had left. Owen did not know it existed. Thomas called the senior relationship manager. The senior relationship manager was warm and professional and regretful and said that the current regulatory environment required additional scrutiny on certain holding structures, which was true enough to not be a lie and incomplete enough to be useless. The refinancing continued to stall. Marcus was irritated. He expressed this irritation in the way he expressed most things, with silence that had a temperature to it, and with shorter answers in meetings, and with a certain quality of stillness that the people around him had learned to read as a signal to be somewhere else. He did not connect it to Daniel Crane. He did not connect it to Elena leaving. He connected it to the regulatory environment, which was, in fairness, genuinely complicated that year. The second crack appeared in June. This one was quieter and more dangerous. It came in the form of a story. A mid-level financial news outlet, not a major publication, but one with a specific readership in the investment community, ran a piece about private equity consolidation in the logistics sector. The piece was largely unremarkable. It mentioned several firms. It mentioned the Voss Group in passing, with a single paragraph that noted, without direct accusation, that certain of the group's acquisition practices had drawn scrutiny from former partners. Former partners. The phrase was careful. Legalistic. It meant nothing and implied everything. The piece was read by roughly 8,000 people. most of them were in the financial community. Several of them were in conversations with Marcus about potential deals. 2 of them pulled back from early-stage discussions without explaining why. Marcus saw the piece. He had Thomas look into the outlet's editorial contacts. He released a brief, professional statement through his communications team. He did not identify the source of the former partner's characterization because he assumed it was a disgruntled ex-contractor from a deal 3 years prior. It was not. The sourcing had come, indirectly and, through 2 removes, from someone with access to a very specific piece of information about a 2019 acquisition in which the Voss Group had moved aggressively and left a smaller firm significantly weakened. This was not illegal. It was barely even unusual. But, in the right framing, with the right context stripped away, it looked bad. The person who had originally flagged this acquisition in a private briefing to a journalist he trusted was a consultant connected to Daniel Crane's network. The specific details in the piece, the dates, the structure of the deal, the internal sequencing, were the kind of details that came from access. Someone had provided them deliberately. Elena had known about this acquisition. She had been present for parts of it. She had also known, from her quiet mapping of Marcus's threat landscape, that it was a vulnerability not because anything wrong had happened, but because it could be told wrong, and because Daniel Crane had the contacts to tell it that way. She had drafted, and never sent, a preemptive briefing to 3 journalists who might matter. She had prepared context materials. She had left them in a folder on a Voss Group server, labeled with a filing code only she would recognize, intending to complete and send them after the Tuesday meeting in November that had ended with Marcus's phone ringing and the folder being set aside. She left before the briefing was sent. The folders sat on the server, labeled and invisible. Owen found it 4 months later while reorganizing a shared drive. He opened it, saw it was some kind of communications prep work, and moved it to an archive folder. He told nobody. There was nothing to tell. He didn't know what it was for. By July, Marcus Voss was beginning to understand, in the way you understand something is wrong with a structure when you feel the floor move slightly underfoot, that something was not functioning correctly. He was not a stupid man. He had built too much on too little to be stupid. He had the instincts of a man who had survived enough competitive environments that his nervous system had developed its own early warning capacity. He could feel, without yet being able to name, that the ground had changed. He called a closed-door review of the group's exposure, financial, reputational, relational. He brought Gerald and Thomas and his head of communications, a woman named Priya, and he sat them all down and asked them to tell him everything that had gone sideways in the last 6 months and why. The meeting took 3 hours. At the end of it, Marcus had a list of 8 situations that had degraded, stalled deals, a cooling relationship with a key supplier, the banking issue, the press piece, 2 social invitations that had not been followed up on by hosts who would normally have followed up. 8 things. None of them catastrophic. All of them a little wrong. He asked Gerald and Thomas and Priya to look for a pattern. They spent 2 weeks looking for a pattern. They did not find one. They did not find one because the pattern was invisible. The pattern was the absence of something, not the presence of something. You cannot audit a missing wall. You cannot run a report on a conversation that was never redirected. You cannot identify an attack on a shield you didn't know you had. What nobody in that room knew, what nobody in the Voss Group knew, because nobody had ever been told, because it had never been formalized, because it had existed entirely in Elena Reyes's careful head and her careful files and her careful relationships, was that for 18 months, someone had been standing between Marcus and the specific form of accumulated pressure that Daniel Crane had been quietly building. And she was gone. Marcus did not call her. This needs to be said, because it was a choice and choices matter. He had her number. He thought about it once, in the back of the car on a Thursday evening, in the specific way you think about something you filed under pride briefly, without resolution, then set aside. He did not call her. Daniel Crane attended 4 events in July. At each one, he was warm. He was collegial. He mentioned the Voss Group in passing twice, once in a panel conversation, once in a dinner table exchange, in ways that were supportive on the surface and precisely calibrated to leave a small residue of doubt in the listener's mind. He was, Marcus's people reported, saying all the right things. He was always saying all the right things. Elena had told Marcus this. She had told him that Daniel's particular gift was the language of endorsement that functioned as erosion. That his praise was a tool and not a compliment. That when Daniel said something kind about the Voss group, the people around him walked away with a faint sense that something was slightly less certain about it than they'd thought before. Marcus had heard this. He had not believed it, because he did not give Daniel Crane enough credit to believe it. He gave him credit now. He gave him credit standing in his kitchen at 11 at night, eating crackers because he hadn't eaten dinner, looking at a summary of social media mentions of the Voss group over the last 90 days that Priya had sent him. The sentiment was not bad. It was just less warm than it had been. Less solid. Like a photograph that had faded slightly and you couldn't say exactly when. He put the phone down on the counter. He thought, for the first time with real specificity, about Elena. Not about her professionally. About her. About the dinner where she'd worn the gray blazer. About the way she'd said, in a voice that didn't change pitch, "Your offer is 11% below what this is worth." About the coffee. About the way she'd known, somehow, what he needed in a room before he'd entered it. He thought about she handles the logistics side. He did not finish the thought. He put the crackers back in the cabinet. But something had shifted in him. Some recognition, arriving far too late, of the shape of what had been in the room with him for 18 months and what that room felt like now. He went to bed. He lay in the dark looking at the ceiling of his penthouse, 34 floors above a city that still said his name carefully, and, he felt, for the first time in a long time, something that might have been afraid. Not of Daniel Crane. Marcus Voss was not afraid of Daniel Crane. He was afraid of the particular kind of blindness that had made him unable to see what was right in front of him until it was gone. He was afraid of himself, a little, which was new. Elena, that same night, was in her apartment 12 blocks away. She had a new job, a senior role at a firm that was smaller than the Voss Group and less complicated and paid her well and asked only for the things she was contracted to give. She liked it. She went home at 6 most days. She cooked her own dinner. She had started running again, which she hadn't done in almost 2 years. She did not know, not specifically, what was happening at the Voss Group. She had not kept connections there that would have told her. She had made a clean cut because she understood herself well enough to know that anything less than clean would keep her in that orbit. But she was smart. She was very smart. And she knew what she had been doing there. She knew what she had left behind. She knew what was unprotected. She wasn't surprised, on some deep level, to find that she still cared about it. That was the thing about loving someone who doesn't look at the walls. The walls still matter to you. You still lie awake doing the structural math. You still know, in your bones, where the load is going and what's going to happen when something shifts. She lay in her bed and she did the math and she didn't like the answer. But she had made a decision. She had made it carefully and she had made it for reasons that were still valid. She was not going back. She was not going to be the person who got called back and came running because the thing she built was starting to crumble. She was not going to let him consume what was left of her. She turned off the light. She slept. 8 blocks from her apartment, in a building that looked nothing from the outside, in a private office that his name did not appear on, Daniel Crane sat across a table from a man named James Hartley and went through a set of documents that had been 6 months in the preparation. James Hartley was a lawyer. He was also the managing partner of a firm that held 2 significant pieces of the Voss Group's legal and regulatory infrastructure. He had been in this role for 4 years. He had been placed in this role, very carefully, by a network of introductions that had begun well before Marcus Voss had any idea what Daniel Crane was actually building. The documents on the table were not dramatic. They were detailed and specific and they identified, with precision, 5 structural points in the Voss Group's holdings where regulatory or legal pressure applied at the right angle would create cascading complications. 5 points. Elena had known about 4 of them. She had sealed 3. She had been working on the 4th when she left. The 5th, she had found it, in late January, 3 weeks before she handed in her resignation. She had documented it in a private note file, encrypted on her personal laptop, intending to address it after she made her decision about leaving. She had made the decision to leave before she addressed it. The note was on her laptop. Her laptop was in her apartment, 12 blocks away. Daniel Crane looked at the 5th point and tapped the page with 2 fingers and said nothing for a moment. Then, he said, "This is where we go." James Hartley nodded. He had the look of a man who has been patient for a long time and finds that patience is, after all, its own reward. "Timeline," he said. Daniel looked at his watch. 3 months, he said. "Give or take." He closed the folder. In the glass tower 34 floors up, the lights in Marcus Voss's office were still on. They were almost always still on. The city moved below it, indifferent and continuous, and the building stood the way buildings stand when they don't know yet what's coming, solid and certain and entirely unaware of the specific point where the load would arrive. It started with a letter. Not a threatening letter. Not a letter full of demands or ultimatums or the kind of language that arrives in a story and announces itself as the pivot point. It was a regulatory inquiry. Formal, procedural, sent on government letterhead to Thomas Brightwell, legal counsel, Voss Group Holdings. It requested documentation related to the ownership structure of a specific subsidiary, a holding company registered in Delaware, connected to one of the Voss Group's most significant real estate assets, a mixed-use development in the northern corridor of Blackwood City called the Selwyn Complex. Thomas read the letter on a Wednesday morning. He read it 3 times. He set it on his desk. He stood up and walked to the window and looked at the city for a moment, which was not something Thomas usually did. Then, he walked to Marcus's office. Marcus read the letter once. He looked at Thomas. He said, "Is there a problem with the Selwyn structure?" Thomas said, "I don't believe so. The structure was set up in 2020 by the previous legal team before I came on board. I can pull the documentation." "Pull it." Thomas pulled it that afternoon. He spent 3 hours going through the original formation documents, the ownership certifications, the annual compliance filings. What he found was not a smoking gun. It was something quieter and more damaging than a smoking gun. It was a gap. A single annual compliance filing for the year 2021 had been submitted with an incorrect classification on a specific line item related to the subsidiary's operating income. The classification was wrong. It was wrong in a way that, in isolation, was a paperwork error. But, in the context of the subsidiary's relationship to the parent company's tax treatment that year, it created a discrepancy. A discrepancy that, if the regulatory inquiry examined it closely, could be interpreted as either an innocent mistake or something considerably less innocent, depending on who was doing the interpreting and what they were looking for. The interpretation would depend entirely on context, on documentation, on the availability of the internal records that showed the decision-making process that led to that filing. Thomas told Marcus this. Marcus asked where the internal records were. Thomas said he was still looking. He looked for 2 days. He found documentation for everything except the specific series of internal decisions made in the quarter before the 2021 filing, decisions that would have explained, clearly and completely, why the classification had been entered the way it was. Those communications, the emails, the meeting notes, the internal briefing, had been stored in a file structure managed by the previous legal team's administrative coordinator. The previous administrative coordinator had left the company in late 2022. When her files were transferred, a folder had been misarchived. Not deleted. Misarchived. It was in the system. It was just in the wrong place, under a subdirectory that nobody had opened in 18 months, buried under a file name that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't created it. Nobody had created it except Elena. This was the 4th fracture she had found. This was the one she had been working on when the dynamic between her and Marcus had finally reached its breaking point. She had found the gap in the 2021 filing. She had traced the misarchived folder. She had located it and flagged it in her private documentation. She had been in the process of pulling it into the correct location and preparing a brief for Thomas when November became December and December became a resignation letter. She had left a note about it. She had left it in the private file on her encrypted laptop. She had intended to address it. She had not addressed it. Owen did not know it existed. Thomas did not know it existed. Marcus did not know it existed. What Thomas found, after 3 days of searching, was the misarchived folder, but he found it empty. The original files had been there once. They had been moved, incorrectly, to a backup system during a server migration the previous year, and, in the migration, a version control error had overwritten them with an earlier, incomplete draft. The complete originals were gone. Thomas sat in his chair and looked at his computer screen for a long time. Then, he called Marcus. "We have a problem," he said. Marcus came to Thomas's office. He sat down. Thomas laid it out. The inquiry. The gap in the 2021 filing. The missing documentation. The context those documents would have provided. The absence of that context. Marcus was very still while Thomas talked. The particular stillness that meant he was running calculations behind his eyes. When Thomas finished, Marcus said, "Who sent the inquiry?" Thomas named the regulatory body. Marcus nodded slowly. "And who knows about the filing gap?" Marcus said. Thomas said, "As of right now? Us." Marcus nodded again. He looked at the window. He said, "How did this inquiry get triggered?" Thomas said, "I don't know yet." Marcus said, "Find out." Thomas found out in 4 days. The inquiry had been triggered by a complaint, a formal, documented complaint submitted to the regulatory body by an anonymous party that included a specific reference to the 2021 filing discrepancy. The complaint knew about the gap. The complaint knew which subsidiary. The complaint knew the year and the specific line item. That level of specificity did not come from guessing. It came from someone who had access to detailed internal information about the Voss Group's holding structure. Marcus got this information on a Monday morning and he sat at his desk for a moment before he picked up his phone and called Priya and said, "Get me everything you have on Daniel Crane's activities in the last 6 months." Priya, to her credit, had been watching Daniel Crane. She had a file. She sent it to Marcus within 2 hours. He read it. He read it the way he hadn't been reading things for months, fully, carefully, with every piece of himself engaged. He read about the 4 events in July. He read the transcript excerpts of the panel conversation and the dinner exchange. He read about the banking relationships. He read about the financial journalist and the connections 3 removes back to Crane's consulting network. He read it like a man who had finally decided to look at the walls. What he saw, reading that file, was the architecture of an 18-month campaign. Patient. Careful. Layered. The kind of campaign built by someone who had identified your specific weaknesses and applied pressure at each one in sequence, slowly enough that nothing looked coordinated, quickly enough to keep momentum. It was, Marcus thought, impressive. He also thought, Elena knew. The thought arrived fully formed, without needing construction. He had been halfway there for weeks. Now he was all the way there. She had known. She had shown him the banking connection, the shell company, the press vulnerability. She had shown him and he had done nothing and then, she had left and the thing she had been protecting had been exposed and now it was being used. He picked up his phone. He put it back down. He picked it up again. He called her. She answered on the 3rd ring, which meant she had seen his name and decided, in the space between the 2nd and 3rd ring, what she was going to do. "Marcus," she said. No warmth. No hostility. Just her name for him, in her voice, which was the same voice it had always been. He said, "I need to talk to you." She said, "I know." There was a pause. Then, she said, "I'll come in at 3. She came in at 3. She walked past Carl at the door without stopping. Carl, who held the door a half-second longer than necessary, who let himself look at her face for just a moment. She walked through the lobby and into the elevator and up to the 34th floor and through the glass doors and into the room where Marcus was standing at the window. He turned when she came in. She looked, he thought, rested. Clear. The way a person looks when they've been sleeping properly and eating at regular hours and not carrying something that doesn't belong to them. He said, "Sit down." She said, "I'll stand." He told her about the inquiry. About the 2021 filing. About the missing documentation. About Thomas's search and what he'd found. He told her without softening it and without performing calm. He just told her. She listened. She did not change expression. She was doing, he recognized, the thing she always did, taking information in completely before reacting to any of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "I found that gap." "I know. I told you about the Crane connection. Twice." "I know. I left notes. They're on my laptop. I can pull them." "I know," he said, for the third time, and something in the way he said it this time was different. It was not the dismissal. It was not the distracted acknowledgement that preceded a phone ringing. It was something quieter. She looked at him. For the first time in possibly their entire acquaintance, Marcus Voss looked at a loss. Not helpless. Not weak. Just undefended, in a way she had never seen him undefended. Without the stillness. Without the gray-eyed extraction mode. He looked like a man who had been running a calculation for a long time and had arrived, finally, at the correct answer, and the answer was not what he had assumed it would be. She said, the original documents might still exist. He frowned. Thomas said they were overwritten. In the primary backup, yes. But I set up a secondary automated backup on that file structure in mid-2022 specifically because the server migration was coming and I didn't trust the migration team to handle it properly. She paused. I set it up under a system account that's technically still active. Nobody would have touched it because nobody knew it was there. The room was very quiet. You set up a backup, Marcus said slowly. Of documentation that I identified as illegal and regulatory exposure, yes. Before I left. Because that's what I did. There was no bitterness in it. It was just the truth, stated plainly, and it landed in the room between them with the weight of everything it meant. He said, "Elena." She said, "Don't." He stopped. She said, "Give me access to the server. I'll find it. I'll give you what you need." She picked up her bag. "And then, we're going to talk about how you address the Daniel Crane problem properly this time, because you have approximately 8 weeks before the inquiry generates a second round of questions, and if you're not prepared for that round, the documentation alone won't save you." He said, "Why are you doing this?" She turned and looked at him fully. Not with love, exactly, or not only with love, which was more complicated. With the look of a person who has made a decision they fully understand and are not pretending about. "Because I built something here," she said. "And I'm not going to let someone burn it down because you didn't bother to look at it." She did not say, "And because I still care about you," which was also true. She did not say, "And because watching you fail at something I could prevent would be its own kind of destruction." She did not say any of the things that lived under the words she did say, because she was Elena, and Elena did not narrate her subtext. She said, "Server access. Today." He gave her the access. She found the backup in 40 minutes. The documentation was intact. Complete. Clear. The communication chain explaining the 2021 filing decision, the legal reasoning, the correspondence, the sign-off. Innocent. Fully explicable. The kind of thing that made the regulatory inquiry dissolve into a non-event once it was in Thomas's hands. Thomas received it that evening. He read it. He said, in his quiet Thomas way, "This resolves everything." Elena spent the next 2 weeks, not on staff, not under contract, operating in a specific gray area that nobody named or formalized, working with Priya and Thomas on the response to the inquiry and on the parallel problem of Daniel Crane. She told them what she knew. All of it. The banking connection and the shell company and the press network and the consultant and the specific methodology of the erosion campaign. She told them in a single 4-hour meeting with her laptop open and her notes displayed on the screen, and she watched the faces around the table as the picture assembled itself for them, and she watched Marcus at the head of the table absorbing it with his full attention, which was, she had to acknowledge, something to witness. When Marcus Voss decided to pay full attention to something, it was like watching a machine engage that had been idling. He would, she knew, be formidable now. He would be formidable in all the ways he had always been formidable, plus one additional way, which was the way of a man who had learned what it cost to miss something. Daniel Crane received his response 3 weeks later. Not a lawsuit. Marcus was too precise for something that public. Not a direct confrontation. A series of very targeted moves through the channels that Crane had been using against the Voss Group, the banking relationships, the press network, the regulatory contacts. Each move was specific. Each move addressed exactly the mechanism Crane had been using and removed it cleanly. It was the kind of counter that required complete knowledge of the opponent's architecture. Complete knowledge of the opponent's architecture was exactly what Elena had provided. It took 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, Daniel Crane was looking at a strategy that had lost its scaffolding, a network that had been quietly made aware of his methodology, and a regulatory inquiry that had closed without finding anything of substance. He was not destroyed. He was not publicly embarrassed. He was simply stopped. Returned to a position where the Voss Group was not a viable target. His smiling eyes, in the one industry event where he and Marcus occupied the same room afterward, were a little less clean. He shook Marcus's hand. He said something warm and meaningless. He moved to the other side of the room. Marcus watched him go. He thought about Elena's voice on the phone saying "I know." He thought about what she had been doing for 18 months and what it had cost her to do it and what it had cost her to leave and what it had cost her, in a completely different way, to come back for those 6 weeks. He did not make a speech about it. He was not a man who made speeches. He did something smaller and more specific. He called Carl. He asked Carl where Elena was at that moment. Carl, who had been driving her to these meetings for the past 6 weeks and who had never once asked a question he wasn't supposed to ask, said, "She just got dropped at her building, sir." Marcus said, "Go back and pick her up. Tell her I'd like to take her to dinner. If she says no, that's fine. If she says yes, take her to Meridian." There was a pause on Carl's end that lasted just a beat too long. Carl said, "Yes, sir." He called back 12 minutes later. "She says yes," Carl said. His voice had a quality to it. The quality of a man who has been watching something from the driver's seat for 2 years and is deeply, quietly glad. Marcus put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the city through the window, 34 floors up, glass and light, the whole machine of it moving below him, and he thought about architecture. About the things that hold buildings up that you never see when you're looking at the building. About how you never know what a wall is doing until it's gone and the load shifts and, suddenly, you feel the floor under you in a completely different way. He had felt the floor move. He was, at 41, learning something that most men learned earlier and that he had been too certain of himself to need, that power without perception is just arrogance with good furniture. That the people who see you clearly, who see your blind spots and choose to stand in front of them not because you asked them to but because they decided to, are not logistics. They are not infrastructure. They are not functions. They are the most expensive thing you will ever take for granted. He picked up his jacket. He went down to the lobby. He did not look at his phone in the elevator. He stood there in the quiet of it, going down, and he thought about what he was going to say and he decided that he was not going to prepare a speech or a strategy or a positioning. He was going to do, for possibly the first time in his adult life, the thing that Elena had been doing since the day she walked into that acquisition meeting. He was going to pay attention. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Carl was already pulling up outside. Marcus walked out into the night. 12 blocks away and closing. Elena was in the back seat, looking out the window at the city passing. She was thinking about what she was walking into. She was thinking about the gray blazer and the crackers in the kitchen and the moment in the meeting room when he had said "I know" 3 times in a row and the third one had been different. She was thinking about walls. She was thinking about how you can know you're the wall and still choose to stand. She did not know how the dinner would go. She did not know what he would say or whether he would say the right thing or whether the right thing even existed in a form he was capable of delivering it. She did not know if this was a beginning or a closing or something entirely without a name. What she knew was this: she had walked away. She had protected herself and she had been right to. She had come back on her terms and she had done what she came to do and she had done it because it was the right thing to do, and if that sounded too clean and too principled for someone who was also in love with him, then that was, she had decided, her business and not the stories. She looked at the city. She thought, I built something there. And it held. Even with no one watching it, it held long enough for me to get back and find it. That was worth something. That was more than something. That was, possibly, the thing. Carl pulled up to Meridian. He got out and opened the door for her, and she stepped out onto the pavement, and Marcus was there, hands in his pockets, looking at her with those flat gray eyes that were, for once, not flat. That were, for once, looking at the wall. Looking at it properly. Like a man who had finally understood what he was looking at. He said, "Thank you. Not for the documentation. Not for the server backup or the briefings or the 6 weeks of work. For all of it. For the 2 years of standing in the specific wind that blows toward everything he had built, quietly, without a word." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Buy me dinner first." She walked inside. He followed. The city moved around the building the way cities do, indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware of the small, specific, important things happening inside the lit windows. But the building stood. All the load-bearing points intact. The fractures sealed. The walls doing what walls do. Holding.